Good morning and welcome to Nottingham Contemporary and to a sensory gathering, a celebration to coincide with the opening of Linder's extraordinary exhibition, The House of Fame. I know a lot of you would have seen the show last night, and if you haven't, do go and see it after this event. Linder and the public programs team here wanted to do something a little different for the opening of this exhibition. And I guess something that kind of gestures to the way in which we're saying that Linder has convened this exhibition, that she's brought together a number of different people and voices, and we wanted to do something, you know, that gestured to that somehow. So we've got a range of different speakers talking about a range of different things. First, I'm going to be in conversation with Kate Brindley. Kate is the head of collections at Chatsworth House and has been a kind of key collaborator of ours over the last year that we've been working on this exhibition with Chatsworth. We'll be followed by Paul Schütze, a London-based Australian artist and perfume expert who'll be talking about the world of perfume and fragrance. And then we'll be followed by Linder in conversation with Naima Karlsson. Naima is the granddaughter of Moki and Cherry, who we were just watching just now. And there's a kind of show within a show, a display of Moki's remarkable works in the final gallery of the exhibition. So, by way of introduction, Kate and I wanted to kind of give some background about Chatsworth, about what Linder has been doing there this last 6 months. But Kate, I wanted to kind of start by asking you, as someone who kind of spent most of your career working in contemporary museums and galleries, what it was like to start at Chatsworth a year or so ago, this kind of place with a 500-year history in this collection that, as far as I can tell, I mean, I have no idea how large it is.
I think we still discover it on an almost daily basis. And it was great. The Duke of Devonshire joined us for an hour last night. He said to me, "Kate, should I come?" And I said, "Yes, you should come." And he came down on the train and he saw one of the objects and said, "I've never seen that before." And that's a bit like it is at Chatsworth. We're still discovering things. I guess I felt a bit like you and Linder felt when you first started discovering Chatsworth, that sort of incredible, overwhelming awe for the beauty and the expansiveness of the collection.
For the scale of it, I remember, Linder, when we first went and we were talking to Susie, the textiles curator, I remember you asking her how many tassels they have, and she said, "Oh, we've got thousands of boxes of tassels," and then opened this door onto a kind of warehouse of boxes of tassels. And there was a kind of sense of, you know, I think you've only had a textiles curator for 5 or so years and are still trying to slowly work through this collection, whereby often you wouldn't know kind of where the work came from, when, or how it entered the collection. So a lot of the questions that Linder was asking the curators and you when we first started out was kind of like, they're quite open questions. What are the works you have relating to collage? What are the instruments you have that might be connected to India in some way?
Yeah. And that's one of the great things about working with Linder she's helped us to explore the collection again and afresh. And I know I can speak for all the curators in that way, and other people at Chatsworth, is by Linder's inquiry. She's helped us to discover more of the collection. And the collections are incredible. The Cavendish family have lived at Chatsworth for 500 years and they still live there. And they have been instrumental in building the collection. And the Duke will say to you that it's always everything was new once, and they continue to collect the new and commission and support artists. So you just saw an image of the sculpture gallery at Chatsworth, which is full of the most incredible sculptures from the early 19th century. And the 6th Duke of Devonshire commissioned that and was a great patron of Canova. So he was commissioning the artists of his time. And that tradition continues. The family still live there. They're still instrumental in the way the house looks. And it's a great time to visit, not just because of Linder's project. Obviously, Linder's project is an amazing accent on the house this year, but also because the family and the house trust that runs the house now has spent £32 million restoring the house over the last 10 years. And it's now looks as it would have done, glinting in the sun with its gold windows, its real gold windows, from 1690, and it is a sight to behold. So it's a great time to visit and to see the house in its glory, but also threaded through it these contemporary moments, and we've tried to actually accent that more this year by bringing out more of the contemporary ceramics and placing things quite subtly, but in a way that starts to train your eye to that contemporary threading through the historic environment.
And so Linder moved to, well, not to Chatsworth, but to the village of Enza it was October, something like that. And Enza, for those of you who haven't visited, it's a very small village of about, I think, 145 people when we first got there, and designed by Paxton around the 1840s for the workers of the estate, right? And so just around the corner of a hill, so you can't quite see the house. And so that's where Linda's been living and working this past 6 months, in a cottage there. But I wanted to ask you, Kate, what having an artist in residence means for Chatsworth, because it's the first time you've had an artist in residence.
I think I was pondering that, and then of course we've had artists throughout centuries working at Chatsworth, because they've crafted the building from Verrio painting the ceilings through to the artistry of the people that have worked on it recently. But we've never had an artist such as Linda has really absorbed herself, lived with us, and has had no agenda. So, and that was an important thing for us, was to give Linda freedom to work and just to inquire and to really get alongside everyone at Chatsworth and understand it and its magic and its allure. And she's been seduced by it, I think. She said she's not been seduced by a house before, so she's been seduced by a house. And she spent her time walking in the grounds, in the garden, discovering the nature and also the culture of Chatsworth. So from everyone from the guides through to the security, through to the family, and spent a lot of time with the curators, the textile team, as you say, uncovering things in the collection which, perhaps we didn't know much about, but also seeing it from a different way.
One of the visits we made last summer was to a space that you call, I think, the Bygone Store. Yes. Which sounded very mysterious, and then I think what lives in the Bygone Store is just all of the collection that doesn't really have a place anywhere else in the house. And so it's all kinds of quite mysterious things, from kind of boxes of 1950s washing powder through to stage lights, through to kind of bits of costume and so on. And it's this kind of total collage of a collection. And I think the collection does feel kind of montaged in some kind of way. It's not kind of ordered as we might expect in a kind of museum collection.
Yeah, and you get a flavour of that with some of the objects that Linda has included in the exhibition. So we've loaned significant number of objects which you'll see in the galleries upstairs, and Linda has placed them in her exhibition. As she says, she's collaged them in her narrative. And we get a lot of requests to loan works, but they're mainly things like the Rembrandt or something. But Linda wanted to borrow hat boxes and buttons and bits of costume, and so the Duke absolutely loved that when he saw the loans list, because I obviously ask him when things are going on loan, and he's really intrigued by that. And the way Linda wanted to explore the narrative of women in the story of the Cavendish family has really come through in the work she's produced in Chatsworth. So Linda very astutely made the point that at Chatsworth we measure time by dukes. So we say, that's the first Duke, or the sixth Duke, or the eighth Duke. And she said she wanted to create a different kind of narrative about the way we measure time, and to discover what is a very strong history of female history at Chatsworth, from Bess of Hardwick, who built the original Chatsworth in the 1550s, right through to Duchess Deborah, who was very much still live in the memory of people at Chatsworth and lived in Enza village where Linda lived. So is a very strong and potent presence at Chatsworth still. So she explored these characters, she explored their aesthetic judgments as well, because they had very strong aesthetic judgments, and she explored their personality, which is quite idiosyncratic as well. So you'll find all that in what she's done at Chatsworth, which I think is So there are 4 installations, and you'll see some of them on the screen, but they work so beautifully in the environment, but they're also a fantastic sort of subtle critique as well, which the Duke really enjoys. He likes working with artists, and he wants that dialogue. So, but you can see here the Elvis cape. So the king is in the building. Chatsworth was built for a king that never came, and Linder's brought the king to Chatsworth.
Yeah, bring together English aristocracy and pop aristocracy, as you were saying. And in this first space as well, what we can't see is there's, in the centre of the hall is an Ottoman incense burner from the collection, for which Linder has developed a fragrance that will be burnt every day. And when we visited about a month ago, when you were installing, Linder was busy working with a number of people from kind of classicists from the Sensory Studies Research Network, who are kind of, as I understand them anyway, and I'm getting probably a lot of this wrong, they seem to be people who've been taught by Mary Beard at some point or another, and are interested not so much in the look of the ancient world, but in the kind of smell, or creating these different olfactory landscapes of ancient Greece. And so when I went to visit, Linder was there with some of these scholars, burning frankincense, burning myrrh, seeing how these different fragrances behaved in the space. And what was surprising to me was that each of these scents just actually moved in different ways. Like one went up the stairs, one went in a completely different direction.
Well, Linder talks about that as snaking through the building, and the snake is the emblem of the family, the Cavendish family. If you look carefully on your visit to Chatsworth, of course, I hope you are all going to come soon, you'll see the snake appearing throughout the building, and the snake in that lead image that Linda's adopted for House of Fame and her Graceland at Chatsworth has the snake as that really strong symbol, and that's very influential for her. I think the bell, there's 2 sound installations as well as 2 sensory experiences, so Linda's made 2. I'm back on. 2 incenses for the house, which we burn a couple of times during the day. And Linder made the point that the painted hall, which is the first incredible, I mean, it's like the wow factor when you come in the building. It's an incredible entrance hall, which it was meant to be the most show-offy bit of the house. And Linder said it wasn't about competing with that space, but adding to, and the scent and the sound is a great way of doing that. Already, we opened to the public today, but just people going around already are absolutely loving the fact that it's been animated with the smell and the sounds. And the bells are recorded in Enza village, so Linder got to know the bell ringers. So it's all from her experience of influencing, snaking through the community of Chatsworth and leaving her mark forever, I think.
And the exhibition here, I think I hadn't quite understood until we started to install it how many snakes there are kind of writhing through the show, from Don Cherry's drumstick holder, which is stitched with a snake, to an engraving by Max Ernst from like 1934. It's an exhibition that's absolutely full of snakes and owls as well. I think the other animals have come through. Yeah. But Kate, you were talking about the works that we've borrowed from Chatsworth. There are about 30 things in total, and they include 19th century sunglasses, a kind of decoupage screen. But I remember really clearly when we went to go to see the Duke and Duchess to kind of see how they felt about us borrowing those things. The Duke looked through the list and just gave us this look which said, "You know we have old masters, right? You don't have to go for these things."
Well, you've got Inigo Jones.
We've got Inigo Jones, yeah.
And that's pretty stellar piece to borrow, isn't it?
And the Inigo Jones piece that we have, there are a number of different costume designs that he did for different masks during the first decade of the 17th century. And one of them that we found actually in the research for the show is a set design for Ben Jonson's mask, The House of Fame. But kind of oddly, we were already working with that title before we discovered that the set designs were in the Chatsworth collection. So there were all of these different serendipitous moments that I think in different kinds of ways inflected the exhibition here, and I guess also some of the interventions that Linder has made at Chatsworth.
No, sure. And I think the relationship with Linder and Chatsworth has definitely been two-way in that I know the team there have been very touched, and the things that through the way she's worked with them, her conversations, the way she's helped them to look and reveal has added to their interpretation of the house, which I think is the best kind of collaboration. And Linda worked very closely with the textile team to make some of the pieces, which again extended what they did, and it was great seeing that emerging in the sewing rooms, the amazing capes and the crinoline, and yeah, so that's the best part of, I think. Linda's our first artist in residence. There's no way she's going to be our last, because I think what it's shown is how that's really worked for us in terms of extending our knowledge of the house and how we want to show it at its best and to reveal its incredible magic and stories to our visitors. And Linda's helped us do that. So,
thank you. I think before we move on to Paul Schütze, does anyone have any questions for Kate, for me? I think there's a roaming mic somewhere. There'll also be time for questions and conversation at the end.
Yeah, and just to say, two of the curators, Sash Giles and Hannah, who's also joining us today, Hannah Obi, worked with Linda from the beginning to help her to navigate the collection. So, because it's quite overwhelming, the collection in the house, and to find those hooks in and those stories, so it's great they've been able to join us. So, and so many people were part of that journey for Linda, discovering those stories. So they're here too. They're much more knowledgeable about Chatsworth than me.
I've got a question. Thank you. Really fascinating talk and an amazing show. So thank you so much. I just wondered about if Linda's work at Chatsworth will enter the collection. What will happen to it once her residency is over?
Well, I think that will be wonderful, and I can't say that it will right now, but that's certainly a desire that something will remain with us at Chatsworth, because I think that would be important for us. So they weren't made to stay there forever. They were made as a temporary intervention, but they are very much grounded in us. So yes, we'll be looking to see what we can do there. Watch this space.
Any other questions? Okay, I think in that case, we should hand over to Paul. Where is Paul? Paul Schütze, who is going to give us a short presentation about perfumes and much else besides. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much. In 2000, I was invited to install quite a big work at the Hayward Gallery as part of the Sonic Boom exhibition. It was based on a sound work I'd already made called Third Sight, and it was basically a large room with Dolby surround sound, 3 projections and a glass floor. And it was an evocation of Peter Zumthor's spa in Vals. I don't know how many people know it, but it's an astonishing, it's kind of extraordinary piece of architecture that could have been built thousands of years ago, happens to have been built 20 years ago, but it has an extraordinary spatial sensory quality. It's full of water of varying temperatures. You can swim from pools inside the building to pools outside the building, so the sonic quality changes, the water temperature changes, the light changes. It's a totally immersive experience. However, the one thing which I didn't have in my show was smell, and smell was a really, really crucial part of the experience of actually being there. And while the piece was really well received, I was acutely aware that if I'd had any idea how to do this, I would somehow have addressed that extra dimension, which I felt would have literally brought the whole thing properly to life. But I thought, like most people, well, it's smell, I'd have to employ a perfumer. That's never going to happen. Perfumers are incredibly expensive, and there are none outside of France, and all of that sort of voodoo. And it took me quite a number of years, 20 years or so after that, and I've always been fascinated by smell and perfume. I've got quite an acute sense of smell, so it impinges on my life, kind of whether I like it or not. So a very, very dear friend of mine about 7 years ago, who's actually here today, very thoughtfully gave my name to a group who were offering the possibility of artists to work in their perfume lab, which was in central London. I didn't even know it was there. And so I went along to this day, basically, where in this enormous sort of Adams drawing room, they had a table that was probably from here to that wall completely covered in perfumery materials. Now, I'd sort of been aware of a few things I could order online and what you could find in a shop to buy, which was all very variable, and I tried to make perfume using these things, and it was kind of hit and miss because a lot of the materials were either off because they're natural and they have a finite life, or they were just not terribly good to begin with. So suddenly you're confronted with, I think there were like 2,000 different materials from all over the world, synthetic, natural. It was really, really like being a child, and it was completely overwhelming. So I got incredibly excited, and by the end of the day, I sort of went to them and said, could I come back? And they went, yes, of course. And they extended this invitation to everyone, but nobody did come back except me. And I sort of managed to somehow stay under their radar for about 18 months, and I went every week and just sort of sat in a corner, and they didn't really notice that I was using huge amounts of incredibly expensive material and lots of time, and they seemed to be happy to have me there. And in that 18 months, I sort of, in a very undirected, intuitive way, taught myself to use the materials. And I had a show of photographs, and I thought, okay, I'm going to actually make a perfume to accompany this show. The photographs were largely of books that were on fire, so it was a fairly clear kind of olfactory terrain to explore there. And also I'd been taking photographs in London's oldest bookshop, Mags, in Berkeley Square, and I'd been down in the archives, and the archives were, at that stage, kind of extraordinary because there were books literally rotting on the floor in piles, amidst which were some pretty priceless things, but I think it was just a London damp problem and a storage problem. So the smell was astonishing. It was kind of visceral and slightly disturbing. So I spent a year trying to make something that I thought properly represented that and properly brought an extra dimension to the photographs. And I finally got there after a lot of trial and error. So I installed the photographs in the old stables of the bookshop. And then I got a very large quarto book, which I painted completely black and then impregnated all the pages with this fragrance. And interestingly, because the book was so large, it lay with the pages spread like wings. And because of the airspace between them, air naturally just ducted through these wings, a little bit like it does through a convection radiator. And it spread the perfume beautifully around the space. It was a really lovely diffusion method, didn't involve any electronics or anything else. And curiously, the one thing that everyone wanted to buy at this show was the fragrance, which of course they couldn't buy because it was full of things that would have taken your skin off if you'd actually put them on your skin. So at the end of this I want to apply this in my work as an artist, which means fragrancing spaces and perfuming objects. But I also like the idea of people being able to wear it. And at that point, the endless conversation about is perfume art? If you wear it, then surely it's merely fashion. There's debate about whether fashion is art. And I kind of thought, actually, do I care, really? I'm just going to make the best perfume I can make, and I don't really care if it's art. I'm an artist, I'm making it, so you could argue that it's art by default. I was asked about 2 years ago I'd taken a whole lot of photographs in the John Soanes Museum at night, which had taken me about 5 years to negotiate this access. And anyone who's been in there can imagine at night it's absolutely astonishing. In fact, we were just talking to Sam about this, that most of the security guards are convinced it's haunted, and they actually draw straws for who runs through the basement on their own at 4 a.m. And one of them admitted to me that he literally jogs through the basement. He finds it so creepy. Because the building makes a lot of sounds. The building also has a lot of smells that are inherent to the age of the materials in the building. So I'd spent a lot of time visiting, a lot of time taking photographs, and then I was asked to make an olfactory intervention on 3 levels just for one night. I think it's every month they do a candlelit night opening, which is really beautiful. So I thought, okay, well, this is really, really interesting because it needs to be in keeping with the house's kind of ornamental character, but it also, what I want to do is try and inhabit the house, try and take you back to the point where the house was inhabited and give you the smells that might have been in it at the time. At this point, they'd just reopened the apartments that the family lived in. Now, these had been inaccessible for decades. So that gave another dimension to it. The implication that it was inhabited was much stronger because of that. So I managed to get hold of, and this sounds very similar to what the research that Linder was doing at Chatsworth, I got hold of all the shopping lists for the house from the period when it was inhabited, and I just went through materials and things that might have been available in the house at the time. So, you know, what pomade did Sir John use? Extraordinarily, incredibly strong pomade in his beard, which, when you think about it, would probably have nose blinded into anything else, because he had literally violet leaf and rose attar all over his face from the first thing in the morning. I got the shopping list for the kitchen. I got the kind of polishes that they used on the floor and on the leather furniture, and spent quite a lot of time formulating 3 fragrances that could be used on the 3 different levels. The other thing that's fascinating about the Soane's house is that not only is it optically very transparent, I mean, again, people who visit it would know it's punctuated with hundreds of skylights. I mean, there are literally skylights everywhere, and there's clever ways of moving light around the building, even down as far as the basement. What you don't notice is there are also clever ways of moving air around the building, and there are ornate brass grills that can be slit open in nearly all the floors. So if you open them, and this is very unusual in a building of that period, you would have smelt the kitchen in the basement from the top floor apartments, because the air can actually move through the house. So when I realised you could do this, I thought, okay, well, what I'm going to do is design 3 fragrances that could then become an infinite number of fragrances at the graduation points where they bleed from one to the other. So they need to be compatible in that way, which is quite a tall order. But what happened, and again, very similar to the experience of the fragrance snaking through Chatsworth, was that certain things that we used in the basement, like frankincense and heavy resinous things, slowly made their way through the grates and travelled up the staircases, and then would stop at certain points, and they'd pool in different parts of the house. So it became a very animated, really, really fascinating occupation of the building. And weirdly at night, the fragrance was so present that it did interfere with what you saw. There's a lot of research at the moment going on into the way people's perceptions and feelings report back to their conscious minds, and there's a phenomenon called conscious penetration, which is the degree to which your brain and what you know and experience impinges upon naked perception. So if you look at a mountain and you're wearing a rucksack full of bricks, it's going to look bigger than if you're not wearing a rucksack full of bricks. Or if you look at a steak and you've just eaten one, it's going to look less appetizing. It's that sort of impinging on what you see. So the sense of all the work in the house, the light in the house, the moonlight coming through the ceiling was really changed by these fragrances. And it sort of made me feel weirdly regretful for all the work that I'd previously done. I now think of most previous work as being slightly incomplete because of the absence of this element. I'm going to pass around a fragrance now, and this, don't rub this on your skin. It's very, very strong, and it's not something you're necessarily going to smell of for very long. What I want to do is show you different approaches to the way you combine smell. My background as a composer ties in incredibly strongly with the way I think about making fragrance, and I mean they're almost completely overlapping. There's no sense at all. I'm just wondering how many of us we are. I often find I'll be working on a piece of music and I will start thinking, really needs the smell of petitgrain, and there's probably not quite enough for everyone, so if you just pass them around. This was something that I made as a direct response to J.G. Ballard's novel The Crystal World, which some of you might know, which is it's one of his disaster novels, but it's the most surreal and the most fantastic. Wow, God, I can smell it from here. Don't put this too close to your nose either. If you're not liking it, don't, Basically, The Crystal World is about a sudden and, as often in his books, inexplicable event during which, particularly in certain jungles, all the animals and the plants and the people who happen to be there start to crystallize and move slowly, and time slows down and they become unable to move at all. But they're not panicking, they're sort of surrendering to this. And actually, interestingly, anyone who's seen Alex Garland's adaptation of, oh God, what's it called? The thing that he just did for Netflix. It's an adaptation of a recent unfilmable science fiction novel, which owes a great deal to Tarkovsky's Stalker. But Garland seems to have conflated a lot of the feeling of The Crystal World into this book as well. Can we have the film and the sound, please? So this piece of imagery and sound links to this. And this pure smell is basically just earth and wetness and vegetal decay, and it should be slightly panic-inducing. It's not meant to be pleasant, it's meant to actually invoke a real thing, which will have associations. There are a lot of materials in it that you will know, you will have encountered, but possibly not in these combinations. There we go. So the sound I made expressly to kind of create a kind of beautiful but oppressive kind of captured feel. The images are meant to be what the creatures that are being slowly crystallized start to see. So their sense of the world is actually just becoming slowed down, it's becoming completely hallucinogenic, and it's becoming quite hypnotic. So hopefully these three elements will kind of start to work in conjunction with one another. Transformation, and it's about shifting states of perception and consciousness. And I'm very interested in the work being done in neuroscience at the moment about where perception and consciousness kind of become blurry, and a lot of the research at the moment in whether AI is a threat or not is very much to do with the way we feel about things and how we react, how we behave based on those feelings. This second fragrance, if you can get rid of the first one so that it's not in your sight line, the second one is a perfume as opposed to an olfactory element. So this is a poetic version of what you just smelled, made out of largely the same things but in completely different ratios. So so this is actually a wearable perfume which we produce. And the point that I'm trying to illustrate here is that the the combining of these elements in exactly the same way that the combining and recombining of sound, if I'm working on sound, or of images. These images are a series of photographs I took of flowers dissolving in tanks of water that have been very, very heavily manipulated and then superimposed on one another. So they're basically enormously reworked. And actually, weirdly, the process of dissolving them in the water, which completely structurally took them apart, is being reversed by actually inflicting this kaleidoscopic geometry back onto them. So in a way, they're being restored artificially into the geometry of flowers. And that's, in a sense, what's happened with that fragrance. All the material, or nearly all the materials in both fragrances are natural, but it just is a matter of how you choose to combine them. So the first fragrance, if I were to release a lot of it into this room, it would probably take a week to go, and it would seep into the concrete, and it would very dramatically transform your experience of being in this room. The room would feel different, it would probably look different, and it would probably be pretty difficult to be in for any length of time. So the visceral quality of smell, even in the absence of any kind of light or any disagreeable image, is so strong because it cuts below the kind of linguistic centers of the brain, which is also, there's been a lot of writing for years about the fact that we have a very impoverished language to deal with smell, and a lot of people, there's been a lot of conjecture that this is cultural, that it's just in our culture that we have this, and that perhaps in a culture where people's vision was occluded, say in a jungle where they couldn't see very far, perhaps there'd be a richer vocabulary that was olfactory. But interestingly, it turns out this is not the case, and the connection, the coaxial cable between our linguistic centres and our olfactory centres is very, very fine. It's very small. There is literally not as strong a link between our sense of vision and our sense of hearing. It's like a physical shortcoming, if you like. And that there is, again, conjecture that in certain animals that link is physically bigger. There are more neurological pathways running between the two things. So we, even if you spend days talking to perfumers, the range, the vocabulary for talking about smell is really, really small, and it's usually analogous. It's orangey, it's leathery, there are very few words that actually are purely olfactory descriptors, and actually most of them are pejorative. So reeking, foul, stinking, I mean there's quite a few pejorative words that are purely olfactory. I guess I'll probably wind up now because I think I'm probably approaching the end of my allotted time. But the thing that I take away from coming quite late in life to this new medium, which is immensely thrilling, I mean, it's literally like discovering sound for the first time, which was just brilliant, is that while there's an enormous amount of voodoo around any discipline, and anyone who's sat in an engineering studio with an engineer trying to make manipulating sound look really difficult so that you can't do it, will know that this also goes across into using fragrance and olfactory things, and it's nonsense. I mean, anyone working in different media could also work in olfaction, and there's no reason not to. And actually, I think there is a real movement now worldwide of introducing people to ways that this can be done. The only thing is, obviously, once you start putting it on your skin, there are pretty ironclad restrictions about what you can and can't use. Some for good reasons, others not. But I guess what I want to do is just sort of celebrate the arrival of a new medium, which really should be being used by far more people, and people should be aware of it, and introducing it into places like Chatsworth, or places like the Soanes, or museums or galleries is a wonderful thing, and it's incredibly exciting. I think that's all, really. Yeah. I don't know, am I meant to take questions, Sam, or should we do that later? Or if there are any questions now, please feel free, or later on. Yeah.
Quite interesting when you said the the disconnection between the language and the olfactory, and comparing it maybe to sound, which is something that you might be familiar with as well. Do you think there might be, in the olfactory, it might be something more direct, instinctive in us, that you automatically know if it's good or bad for you or something?
Well, it's very subjective. So, but also, actually, one really interesting thing is when you buy a perfume, there's a list of notes that are in the perfume. Now, and everyone assumes that means those notes are in the perfume. That's so not the case. That list of notes is designed to put you into a particular frame of mind, as is the bottle and the name of the perfume. So the perfume that I sent around second is called Behind the Rain. And just briefly, the story of that is it's an attempt to recapture an extraordinary smell, olfactory experience I had on an island in Greece where we ran for cover under a whole bunch of conifer trees in a violent storm. And the storm just stopped, the sun came out, and suddenly this astounding smell just started washing down from the trees, which is a consequence of them being bruised by this rainstorm. That's a true story, and a lot of the material in that perfume is a direct attempt to emulate exactly what happened then. Most commercial perfumes, they will say, well, it's meant to evoke a night on the Riviera or whatever, and you're going to smell this flower and this spice and this. Chances are none of those things are in there, but because we're very unsure about what we're smelling, if I gave you a list of things and I told you they were in that last perfume, you'd go, yeah, I can smell that. And the list could be anything. It's amazing. You will start to smell things if someone suggests they're there. So I think with sound, because we're a bit more certain about what we're hearing, it's much harder to tell someone there are trombones in a piece of music where there clearly aren't. But with perfume, you can say, well, yes, there's orange blossom in there. There can be none at all, and you will start to smell. I will start to smell, even when I know it's not there. So that it defeats the kind of linguistic centres of the brain, I think, because it is very subjective and we're not very confident about what we can smell. So, for example, if a major perfume company decided to tweak a formula of your favourite perfume and take out half the things you love, most people will assume the problem is with their nose, not that this new bottle of their favourite perfume is completely different to the last bottle they bought. I don't know if that makes...
A sound might not kill you. I mean, going to back to basic.
Yes.
Thing, a sound might not kill you. It's something that you see, it will rarely kill you. But something that you smell and you might get a response that you should get away from that.
Yeah, I guess that is true. Although, of course, if you're living in the jungle, a sound which could be a jaguar on the other side of the tree could absolutely kill you. Yeah. So I mean, it's more what they're telling you.
The sound will kill you.
Well, yeah, absolutely. No, sound certainly can kill you. I do remember the Germans had some fantastic riot cannons in the 60s, which were sub-audio cannons, and they turn them on and you just lose all control of everything. Anyway, just gloss over that thought. But the parallels between sound and fragrance, I mean, I find they're infinite. Like, you can discuss both of them with interchangeable terms, and every new analogy you make is builds on it and it becomes stronger. Someone down there? Oh, sorry.
Paul, thank you. That was fascinating. I have a question about artists using fragrance, or the history of artists using fragrance. So I think just the way art history is taught, we're familiar with images of exhibitions in the 20s and 30s and 40s. We don't know how they sounded often. We don't know how they smelt. And I think some of the surrealists, I think, used fragrances at points in exhibitions. But I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the kind of history of artists using smells.
Well, I mean, as far as we know, the first emphatic use of fragrance was by some of the futurists, who actually in the manifestos they actually talk about touch and smell as being key parts. They tended to be what you would imagine they would be, sort of engine oil, petrol, confronting industrial kind of smells. There's obviously the famous Rose Célavy Duchamp repackaging of, I can't remember what it was now, but it was a famous fragrance of the time. Belle Hélène it was, yeah. And then also there's the air of today, which, the encapsulated air, which probably did smell of something. There's a lot of artists. There was a sort of gap between that period and then people, for example, like Joseph Beuys's use of materials that inherently smelt like the felt and the wax and the fat. Dieter Roth used bread and chocolate a lot, and that now there are a lot of artists. There's an amazing Dutch artist called Peter de Cooper, who's really bizarrely little known, and including by me. And I a couple of years ago picked up this massive monograph. It's like a phone book of his work going back 40 years, and it's almost entirely olfactory. So it's interesting that he's been practicing for so long and been largely ignored. But now I think his time has come, because he's actually there's an experimental scent summit in London in April, and he's going to be a guest at that. So there's an amazing woman called Sissel Tollas, who's a Norwegian artist who. She's also a trained chemist, and she works for one of the big fragrance houses in Germany, I think. And she purely works with olfaction, and she does very, very confronting things. And she did an amazing piece, which is, I think it's called The Smell of Fear. And it is literally the smell of fear. She got, I think, 10 men, found out what terrified the daylights out of them, did it to them, and then basically harvested their sweat and pheromones and applied it to the walls of a gallery. And it does communicate, apparently. I didn't actually experience it, but she does a lot of things like that. She does a lot of mining of materials. So she has an amazing fragrance or a project called Oil, which is oil taken from the deepest reserve in the middle of the North Pole, and then some chemical process has been applied to it, but you are smelling something which has come from a mile down into the Earth's core, and it's an amazing connection. And it's the same connection that you make when you're presented with an object from history. This is just a sort of geographic proximity and obviously a geological one as well. There are a lot of artists now working. Sometimes it'll just be on one project. Peter de Cooper's probably the person who is the most completely focused on it and has the most experience, though. Yeah.
In terms of scent being a sensory thing that is the least developed in the human being. So do you think smell has the possibility to allow us a look into time travel in a sort of Proustian sense?
Well, it famously is the memory trigger. So there's at least mental time travel. Beyond that, I don't know. There are two theories about how we perceive smell. One of them is the prevailing theory, which is that we have receptors that are different shapes in our olfactory bulb, and molecules of the corresponding shape lock onto the receptor. So we can only smell as many molecules as we have shaped receptors. The other theory, which is more controversial and is championed by Luca Turin, is that it's a vibratory thing. And he's really, really, really desperately trying to prove this, because if it is the case, then smell probably works on a quantum level, at which point the whole issue of time travel becomes not more feasible, but it becomes more likely than with the other theory. So he's been studying recently the way bees perceive smell, and it looks as though it involves quantum tunneling. Please don't ask me to explain how that works. I kind of can just about picture it as a diagram, but I couldn't explain it. But what it means is that the particles leap across divides when the circumstances are correct, and that leap will register the smell. So what it means is potentially there are infinitely more things we could smell than we thought we could. But that's not proven. So, I mean, yeah, who knows? Yeah, we done? Great. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. Hello. It gives me tremendous pleasure to introduce Naima Karlsson, photographer, musician, and artist. We've been in conversation now for approximately 6 months.
Constantly.
Constantly. And before we go into the details of that conversation, there's one person I'd really like to acknowledge as the sort of glue of this, the glue of this friendship. And that person is the late and great Judy Blame, who passed away recently. Judy Blame was an extraordinary stylist, jewellery maker, and extraordinary person. Yes. And I emailed Judy, it probably would have been September, to say, I've seen the works of Moki Cherry, and I'm so excited by them. And I really want to make contact with the Cherry family. And Judy sent an email immediately, I think the same day or the day later, you responded. So really this conversation and the showing of Moki Cherry's works all go back to the generosity and kindness of Judy Blame. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. And for my part, I first discovered the work of both Moki Cherry and Don Cherry in the late 1970s. I think the first album of Don Cherry's that I listened to was Brown Rice, which was released, I think, in 1975. And Moki Cherry had done the artwork and also played Tempura. And she was always on the sort of periphery of my knowledge and awareness. But it was only last year that I finally saw Moki's work at Moderna Museet in Stockholm. And although I was there only for, I think it was 45 minutes, and was about to be shown the treasures of the collection there, once I knew that Moki Cherry's textiles were being shown, I just went straight to them and immediately was taken and transported into this world of Don and Moki Cherry. And I was hooked. I was particularly hooked by their motto, or their dictum, which was, the home is a stage, and the stage is a home. And that's really influenced the work I've made at Chatsworth, which is a very stagey home, and a home is a stage. And also has really influenced the curatorial process of this exhibition. So I'd like to talk to Naima now. And I think you want to begin by reading something out to us.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for inviting me here to talk to you, and for having so many of Moki's works in the show. It's just wonderful. And all of our family that are here and not here, overjoyed about it. Yeah, well, I thought it would make sense to read some of Moki's writings, and hear the story from her. Makes more sense than from me. She was always wrote a lot and was a wonderful writer, even though, she was an artist, but she wrote constantly in notebooks. There's so many notebooks, and she liked to play with words. Of course, some of the tapestries have also got words in. Mm-hmm. And she kind of did always write a lot. And then in her later years, a bit before she died in the 2000s, she started kind of writing her and Don's story, and all in little pieces, and she was doing a creative writing course. I don't know if she maybe was thinking of actually it would become a book, but I know she didn't actually ever say that to me, but maybe that was her idea, to try and tell their story. But sadly, she died unexpectedly in 2009, so she didn't finish. But there is lots of text, and it's a great resource, and hopefully will be in a book that's going to come about her. So the first bit I'm going to read is she wrote in 2003 called Moki and Don's Collaboration. To experience love, to give love, to receive love, to share love, in life, to make it work, through work, to search for a way to see if life and living in itself, in art, by being a creative process. Don and Moki, we had that opportunity. We were each other's muse. I loved his music and playing. He inspired me to express myself visually, and Don loved my work. The stage is home, and home is a stage. So started our collaboration. The jazz club was Don's environment. The changing of audiences between sets, often smoky basements or cellars with no air conditioning, became wary. At first, we called the project Movement, which soon was changed to Organic Music, and at times, Organic Music Theatre. Our first concert event took place in Stockholm in the summer of 1967. We found the space, invited all of the musicians and some dancers. I made posters, designed the stage, and did live painting with the music. Sold out and with great response on every level, we were very encouraged. We were onto something that seemed to work and was great fun. A few days later, we packed the car belonging to Mafi Fillet, a Turkish trumpet player living in Stockholm, with the sky, loads of fabric, sewing machine, instruments, etc. Don, Nena, and myself drove with Mafi to Copenhagen. We rented a beautiful old hall at Charlottenborg, the art academy, did the same thing, invited musicians, made posters, etc. I remember I used a park to paint huge chunks of fabric for the stage, designed and made costumes. Some of the musicians were insects. Don was a tiger. Some had simple face painting. We invited a friend of ours who was a chemist and made fireworks as a hobby. He put on an amazing display in the courtyard during the intermission. Mafi went back to Stockholm. Don, Nena, and I went to the train with all of our stuff. We had a friend who worked on Wagon Lit. I think that's the train company I've figured out since then. So we went to Paris. After a few days, we found ourselves locked out of our hotel room. The concierge wanted francs. Don took his trumpet and a painting of mine and went down to Place l'Odéon. It was rush hour. I stayed in the lobby with Nena. A while later, Don came back with a producer from French television. This is how it happened that we became part of the premiere of colored TV in France. The next morning, I was at the TV studio painting huge panels for the set. There up on the ladder, I knew I was pregnant. Eagle Eye was inside of me. We put on a concert event in the American Culture Center and one in Germany. We then took the Wagon Lit with our friends back to Stockholm. Later that fall, Don went to New York to record Where is Brooklyn for Blue Note. A painting I did while we lived in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, was used for the cover. It was the first of my many sleeves for Don's recordings. Nana and I remained in Stockholm. I painted our apartment into a world of its own. This is a bit of the story of how we started working together, Don Cherry and myself, Moki. Eagle Eye was born on May 7th, 1968 at 2:22 a.m. In September 1968, we had to leave our wonderful but very primitive apartment in the old town in Stockholm. We'd been there for 5 years. The time had arrived to modernize these ancient buildings and bring the people with money in. We packed up and stored most of our things with friends in the countryside. We went to the train station with our children and the tools for our work, leaving Stockholm and never to live there again. After they left Stockholm, I was just going to fill you in a bit before the other bit of text. They basically traveled around for a couple of years, trying to figure out what they wanted to do next, and I think maybe not really wanting to be in the city, but I think they just kind of will see where it was going to take them, So, and actually they were in New York quite a lot in the beginning, living in a whole variety of places, different kind of rented rooms, some lofts, even, as my mum has said, a basement with no windows, probably with lots of Moki's tapestries all on the walls to kind of cheer it up a bit. But they kind of kept never really being able to find anywhere to settle and were moving around. But also I think they were trying to explore where they would go. And so they were in America quite a bit. Then I think Moki really wanted to get out of the city and they went and lived in upstate New York in a place called Congers. And then eventually in 1969, Don became artist in residence at Dartmouth College, and was like a tutor in music, and he had a group of students there for 2 semesters, and then him and Moki put on a whole opera that they wrote and created with the students, and created, I've never seen any pictures or anything of it, but I want to try and find them. So I think after that, those 2 terms there, they really got into this idea of music education and wanting to do maybe a school. So they went back to Sweden and trying to figure out maybe where they could do this. And then there's this other little bit of text Moki's written about how they ended up finding Torgap, which is, their home that they eventually found and where we still live, which was originally a school before they bought it. Torgap. We were looking for a home back in Europe, Sweden, with great inspiration from our experiences and meetings at Dartmouth. The first and only time we had the pleasure of a salary. Money every month. I had sent a bit of it to my parents monthly towards a house. For us to try and buy property in the US had been a futile undertaking, with a vision of finding a place big enough for workshops, rehearsals, meetings, etc. In a minivan, we drove all the way to the Arctic Sea. I was born in Lapland. We had visited my parents twice. The midnight sun and the 24-hour light concept mesmerized Don. It was too late. The area was being depopulated with schools and stores closing. In a landscape with vast distances, not very practical for modern nomads. We turned around and drove over the tundra down through Finland to Copenhagen and to the US Embassy to give the States another try. The children and myself got very short-term visas. I went out into the street and called a real estate agent in Hässleholm, southern Sweden, the area that my father was born in. A beautiful nature and air. Knowing that they were discontinuing the country schools in Sweden, I called up and asked, "Do you have an old schoolhouse for sale?" "Yes," they replied. "In Torgap, 20 kilometers north of Hässleholm." I told him we would be there in a couple of hours. When we drove into the schoolyard, there was a rainbow over the house. "This is it, baby," said Don. We paid $4,000 for this heavenly house, with 11 wood-burning stoves, uninsulated walls, and a good smell. This is how we found Torgap Skola. We moved in on September 9th, 1970. This anniversary is celebrated whenever we are there on that date. We got our belongings out of storage, including the piano that we could not get out of the van on our own. So Don resorted to practicing and composing new inspired work in the van for a while, much to the amusement of our new and very curious neighbors. Finally, we called in the professional movers. We closed our eyes and held our breath when they carried it up over the stone stairs. Torgap became a center, its own universe. In one classroom, we built a small theater. The other one became my studio. In the teachers' apartments, we painted all of the rooms different colors. Spring came. I made kitchen gardens, flowers, and flower beds for scent and beauty all mixed. Could I ever dream of how many meals I was to cook or overnight guest beds I'd make? No. With the air and atmosphere resounding with the most beautiful live music, it made me say yes to it all. The summer of 1971, we spent in an exhibition. Pontus Hultén invited us to be the live element of a big show, Utopia and Visions, 1871 to 1981, at the Moderna Museet in Stockholm. We lived in the geodesic dome with my environmental art. Each day, I painted part of the floor as a diary, building up to a mandala. The visitors participated in live music, talking, dressing up, or photographing themselves in an automat, and other improvised activities. We communicated with people internationally via telex that was hooked up in New York, Tokyo, and Bombay. The museum building had previously belonged to the Navy. When the show closed at 6 p.m., I would go into a prison cell where I had a kitchen set up. Nena, 7, and Eagle Eye, 3, used to say, "We're going to play in the collections while you cook." In August, we went with Organic Music to play festivals in the south of France, which was to be the beginning of 6 years of such engagements in France and Italy, from the tip of the boot in Sicily and Sardinia right up to the Alps. Before these tours, all of the musicians used to come to Torgap for rehearsals and preparations. I used to work on sets, clothes, cooking and mulching the garden. to be certain that there would be one by the time we returned home. I'd make dookie burgers, which are like these veggie burgers she'd make out of dookie beans. I'd make dookie burgers for the road, pack the bus with all the various gas stoves, etc., etc. We stayed in nice camping grounds to make it more fun for the kids. Our favourite was Monte Antena in Rome, on one of the 7 hills with beautiful pine trees. We used to have press conferences there with journalists enjoying good food and the musicians playing with that soft sound of pines in the background. Eagle Eye, who is a musician, was in Rome a few years ago. He asked to be taken to Monte Antena. It's now built up with high-rise condominiums. Sometimes we stayed on the grounds of the festivals. I found a great joy in going to local markets with the children and finding the culinary specialities of each vicinity, always cooking, sometimes under absurd circumstances.
Thank you for reading that out. Hearing that text again, it's the first time I've heard it read out, but of course, very much with the show above us in mind too. The first image you see in the first gallery is the House of the Future, which was designed by Alison and Peter Smithson in 1956. And Alison Smithson she placed a sewing machine in the kitchen. She realised the importance of creating one's own, whether it's textiles or clothes to wear. And there are reports of the Smithsons, because they wanted to wear clothes that reflected the House of the Future. They couldn't buy them in the shops at the time. So Alison Smithson would get out a sewing machine to make the clothes that were a sartorial parallel to the architecture of the House of the Future. Right. So that was one immediate trigger that was happening. Yeah. And also my research at Chatsworth, that Bess of Hardwick, building the first Chatsworth in 1550, having to hold Mary Queen of Scots there prisoner. And the main way those two women managed to somehow live together for 15 years when Mary Queen of Scots was under house arrest was through textiles, was through making tapestries, through making bed coverings, through making wall coverings. And so in a way, in my head, I can position Moki in this sort of amazing trajectory of women working with textiles to create not just homes, but quite extraordinary homes. And homes here that is shifting throughout Europe, and a home that can pop up in New York.
Well, then it became, that your home is wherever you are. You have enough of the right tools with you, the right materials, literally materials as well, to just, set it up and create it, And I think that exact kind of statement, the stage as a home is a stage, by Moki, I think maybe what she was really trying to say with that is like, whatever you could possibly imagine, whatever you could possibly, dream up, is if you can set the scene for it, then it can be part of your reality. You can recreate it, you can transform it, or you transcend reality into, whatever you could try and imagine. It's like, like a piece of theatre.
Yes.
You set the scene for it. You don't have to. It's like going beyond the spaces already. You don't have to be confined to the spaces we're in. If there's something you want to do, create the space for it, create the stage for it, dream it up or whatever, create through creativity, you can make it happen.
And you also helped your grandmother to make some of the textile pieces. You told me
I
later in her life.
Well, all the textile pieces here are from the 70s, so yes I didn't. But I did help her a lot with, actually later when I was growing up, and with installing exhibitions and just being around, and I helped her quite a lot with some various different exhibitions and just being there.
And what do you think you as an individual took from that relationship with your grandmother?
I actually learned a lot about actually hanging exhibitions, because she was a bit of a professional of that. Just like the actual approach to making it all work, like in a room and stuff, which I have definitely taken a lot from being an artist myself now. And also just that everything, the creativity infiltrates into everything around you. And I think that what her and Don were really trying to do was like finding that kind of interconnectedness, no divides between any kind of like your surfaces of your life. It's like a union between kind of like sound, spirit, and image into everything, and like transcending in a way. So it just kind of flows like nature or whatever. And then the other way around, if you were actually on a stage, is that everything that's in your life, everything part of your life, everything you're living every day, you know, can be shared with people on the stage. That it doesn't have to be just like professional, perfect representation of yourself. It's like that your whole life is, you know, summarized somehow and shared with everyone else on that stage, and that there wasn't really, they didn't want it to be so much difference between what was happening there or happening wherever else you were.
Which in contemporary music is quite, we're now in the age of incredible production through videos, through the styling of imagery, but in a way it was all working on quite a modest scale, wasn't it? They would just turn up where they wanted to go and create the environments and then go off again. It seemed both very generous and without ego. That they would, it was in the here and now, it was transient. I mean, thankfully there was, we're seeing all these images behind you as you speak, Naima. So we do thankfully have records of that. Yeah. Visitors who walked into the last gallery, which we call the abode of sound anyway, because this idea that you have the house of the future, the house of rest, the house of unrest. And by the fourth gallery, I wanted the idea that even the house itself was beginning to become aerosolic. It was beginning to disappear and break up. Right, yeah. So putting Moki's work in there, alongside Penny Slinger's tapestries, with Maud McCarthy's Vina, seemed really, to me it's one of the most charged spaces. But as people walk into that, and hopefully you'll all visit there today if you haven't, there is this great sense of serenity and presence. And part of me wonders if all those tapestries somehow absorbed all those mantras, all those prayers, as if they're still transmitting in some way. Do you experience that? I mean, must.
This morning I was thinking like how that room sort of feels a bit like a temple or something. You know, it has a wonderful energy, and with the sound as well, I think it makes it just like a wonderful experience, like, you know, to be in there. And there is a lot of energy. So,
there is, isn't there?
Yeah.
Which we must not be shy of talking about. I think something else that is very, very important. Don Cherry visited India in 1973, I think it was, isn't it? And within the exhibition, lots and lots of works constellate around the year 1981, because Alison and Peter Smithson envisioned the House of the Future existing in 1981. And one of my favourite books ever, which is called The World of Sound, Nada Brahma, by Joachim Berendt, was published in 1981. And Don Cherry is really singled out in this book of being one of the first jazz pioneers to go out to India. I'm going to read a small extract to try and contextualise that, which will also help to maybe contextualise some of the images we are seeing. So bear with me. This book has many post-it notes which I had to remove, so at least I could find my page this morning. This is an extract. There's a text by the great Sufi master Hazrat Inayat Khan that has been making the rounds around Western musicians since the end of the 60s. For years, its complete version existed only as a private printing of the London Sufi mission. In an abridged form, however, you can find it all over, in thousands of copies, quoted in articles and interviews. Occasionally, musicians will enclose a copy with a Christmas or birthday greeting. This text expresses the musical and spiritual consciousness of the young generation of musicians precisely and representatively. Here are some excerpts. What we call music in our everyday language is only a miniature from that musical harmony of the whole universe, which is working behind everything, and which is the source and origin of nature. It is because of this that the wise of all ages have considered music to be a sacred art. For in music, the seer can see the picture of the whole universe. All the religions have taught us that the origin of the whole of creation is sound. No doubt the way in which this word is used in our everyday language is a limitation of that sound, which is suggested by the scriptures. The music of the universe is the background of the small picture which we call music. Our sense of music, our attraction to music, shows that there is a music in the depth of our being. Music is behind the working of the whole universe. Music is not only life's greatest object, but it is life itself. And on the next page, Berent talks about Don Cherry. The contemporary Western musician who first called attention to this text, at least he was the first for me, but I know that he was also the first for many others, is the trumpet player Don Cherry. His development has been exemplary for this entire generation of musicians, from jazz with its tie to the blues music of the black ghettos and to the gospel sounds of the Baptist congregations, to ever greater musical and spiritual openness, in which all the cultures of the world come together like the pieces of a mosaic that is one great whole. Like thousands of other musicians the world over, Don Cherry lives today with a musical and spiritual tradition that makes it impossible for him to conceive of any one cultural stream or branch as more esoteric, more remote, more exotic than any other one. Exotic for whom, he once asked. They for you, or you for them? I know that you have an ensemble called Exotic Sin.
Yeah, that's what we were just saying.
This is before we knew about Don's commentary about what is exotic.
Yeah.
And it's a really, really important question.
Is it switched on?
You switched off again.
Yeah? Am I switched on? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. It's true. Just when we were talking about the text before this started, and he was talking about the exotic, and I thought it was funny that the kind of duo that I've just formed with my friend is called Exotic Sin. So yeah. So no, all the sins of the exotic presumptions or something.
Yeah, exactly. Because when you first see these images, that word almost springs to mind in that very limited, obvious way of, this looks very, very exotic.
Yeah.
And yet it wasn't remotely, I presume, exotic for Don and Moki. It was everyday life.
Well, no, I think that, definitely when Don met Moki, when they first met, which was gradually over when he came for different concerts and tours to Stockholm, touring, I think, with Sonny Rollins and with Albert Eiler. So he met when he came on different instances, and they gradually got to know each other. But I think, from meeting her and her kind of really living creativity in everything that she did, just for what she was wearing, and then I think when he saw her home, and I think he really realized there was a whole other way you could really push improvisation and the creativity that he had already probably learned so much, in terms of freedom of expression in music, in the Ornette Coleman Quartet, and really taking music in, a whole new direction, reshaping it, finding your own kind of vision. I think Don said himself that Ornette was his greatest teacher of that, was his guru of that. But then after he was not part of that quartet anymore, I think during the time when he met Moki, 63, 64, that time, 65, I think he was probably trying to figure out where he wanted to find his own direction, and find his own, where he wanted to really go to those new territories. And I think that's something to do with their creative collaboration that somehow helped him to kind of see the way that he wanted to take it, and then also Moki with her artwork, and they kind of went in that way together, that really kind of expanding on the idea of improvisation into the visual, the invisible, the spiritual. Of course, improvisation is kind of going inside and expressing, the emotions, your imagination, giving form to it in some way or another. But I think maybe Don realized beyond not just jazz music, but there was other ways it could be part of everything, and I think that them together I think maybe that Moki's interest in, say, her art of she was, always, you can see from lots of the books that we have of hers and of theirs, very interested in studying kind of traditions, artifacts, or let's say kind of cultural traditions of the East or of Africa, or a lot of ancient cultures. And I think that maybe that they got really into together a whole discovery, especially in kind of like aesthetics and methods and spiritual and musical methods of the East and Africa. And then kind of they went sort of, I think that's where they really went on that kind of journey together, and eventually got, then quite, actually seriously into kind of practicing Tibetan Buddhism. And I think you can see that a lot in the tapestries, upstairs.
Absolutely.
If people may or may not know about like the Tibetan tanka paintings, which are they're like paintings with also like embroidery and silk applique around the edges, used a lot in Tibet in monasteries, but also for like gatherings and festivals, that would have this kind of very elaborate, really colourful depictions of both like earthly and transcendental scenes that were not actually, and they could be rolled up and then hung out anywhere where they take them. And they were actually intended as like a visual tool, more not just as a decorative artwork. It was supposed to be like a visual tool for kind of like internal introspection, for visualization, and for like kind of one's own kind of exploration of consciousness. And I think that a lot of the tapestries that they ended up having for the performances was that it tended for that, just a kind of tool to let people, kind of go into their own kind of consciousness and explore that. And the mandala as well, the mandalas is also another version. It's like Indian Tibetan artworks that are like a depiction of it's kind of like a geometric diagram of the mind. It's like some kind of giving form to one's consciousness. And I think that that's what they were always kind of playing with, that kind of visible and invisible thing, kind of fantasy and reality, and of course expanding on one's own consciousness. I thought it was really interesting because apparently one definition of a mandala is that it's a temple of the spirit.
Ah, good definition.
And there's a mandala on one of the tapestries upstairs. And actually I think maybe the little pink one hanging on the ceiling is a kind of type of mandala as well.
And for me, it's quite interesting when going right back to Brown Rice album from 1975, I think, and Moki Cherry is playing tambura, which is I think you probably see it occasionally coming up on screen. I too study and practice Indian classical music, and the very, very early stages of learning Indian music, one has to have a tambura playing day and night for at least the first month. So the tambura is a four-stringed instrument that produces what we call in the West a drone. And often in the West that's seen as a kind of subsidiary instrument that is laying a sound current upon which other instruments can then solo or embroider or improvise on the top. But the tambura is so important, and that's why I'm interested that Moki plays that instrument, because really I think the way it's described when we were first introduced to that sound, which, although it's just four notes that repeat and repeat and repeat, there's something very, very, very hypnotic about it. But in a way, it's, again, back to the idea of collage. The tambura is that glue. And once that sound begins, it's almost like that sonic glue. Again, that snakiness, that sonic glue is there. And it's a position, I think, of great humility. When you play tambura, you are also sitting back, but you're providing that sort of, that sonic stage in a way for the soloist to then improvise over.
Right.
So I'm really interested in plays tambura.
Yeah. I would love to learn how to play, actually. Yeah, it's like a continuous foundation, like eternal sound.
Absolutely, absolutely that. I'm aware also of, we play with time all the time in the exhibition, but I'm also aware of time in the real time now.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how long we've been talking for, but it's 10 minutes or half an hour. Are we running out of time? Should we allow time for questions now? Okay, I've said time about 10 times in 1 minute. Time for questions.
Question time.
Question time. Or universal silence time.
Yeah.
It could be universal silence time. I could just sit in silence for 1 minute, couldn't we? Oh, there's somebody there, I think.
Could you talk a little bit about your ideas in relation to lace, because you've selected some lace for the exhibition. And I just wondered if you could elaborate a little more on what you selected and how that links to your aesthetic and ideas.
Well, of course, we're sitting in what was once the centre of the lace-making district. I think the idea of lace as both a grid structure that you then can embellish with pattern works metaphorically across the show anyway. And I think sound, weaving sound, weaving threads, weaving conceptual threads goes throughout the curatorial process. So there's not... Lace crops up as a sort of motif going through across all 4 galleries. And I think we've actually reined in our use of it. Again, we're trying to do everything with quite a light touch in this exhibition, not sort of underlining or highlighting things too much so that the visitor can make their own associations. So we have lace exhibits from the Nottingham and Trent Lace Archive. We have a photograph by Isabel Cowper from the V&A. I myself wear lace. Judy Blame includes lace within a piece. This was due to Naima's careful eye in selecting the pieces that we were going to include here.
Yeah, and he made his own lace with the fag burns in the hanky thing.
Which I love, that idea of, getting out the cigarette and making lace. Yeah. So it's definitely, I think it's for everyone. You can join your own dots throughout this and make different constellations as you do so. And I think almost, returning always back to the theme of this conversation, it's that, I suppose, lace is part of staging the human body, particularly often the female body. What happens when the female body is wearing white lace, and what happens when you change the colour, for example, to black lace? All those questions are sort of, they sit in the air, they're unanswered. So it's just... we're in the heart of what was once the lake making district of not only Nottingham but also of England. I've talked too much the last 48 hours. Any other questions?
Hi, just if you could maybe fill us in a little bit more with regards to the time perception that was mentioned within Chatsworth House, your reinterpretation, your reimagining of the time aspect of it, the narrative.
Well, I think almost looping right back to books such as this, I've always had a huge interest in time anyway, and how time is represented in the East and in the West. I have trouble timekeeping sometimes. And when I stepped into Chatsworth, I really had to relinquish all methods of timekeeping because, again, it's very tricksy there. Time slips, time trips you up. You think you're looking at a piece from perhaps the 16th century, then you realise it's the early 19th century, vice versa. You're condensing 500 years of history into a 6-month period of research. I think looping... I'm just very aware of keeping the focus around Moki and Don's work at this time. They're playing with time. Don's that voyage to India, and I know from learning with my teacher that sometimes we have to learn rhythms that are 17 and a half beat patterns, whereas in the West normally it's 3, 4, 4, 4. It's relatively straightforward, and suddenly somebody's in front of you saying you're going to count 17 and a half beats per cycle, and my head then just I can't do it intellectually, I can't do it logically. I think likewise going to Chatsworth, I haven't got the kind of brain that's very methodical that can think the 6th Duke, that must mean this date, or the 9th Duke. So the way I work with time, both at Chatsworth, in life in general, and I have maybe the cherries are working with time, is far more fluid. It's difficult to pin down. I think it's a more visceral sense of time. And there are various prompts of time in Chatsworth through the senses, through smell, through the sounds you hear, clocks ticking that were made in different centuries, and they're all slightly out of sync. So on the hour, you get clocks ticking for clocks chiming maybe over a 2-minute period, because they're all slightly out of sync. And even the church in the village where I've been living, there's this pendulum there. And every month it's assessed, and it's very low tech. You put every penny you put on the pendulum or remove from the pendulum gives you 3 seconds. So it's quite interesting that in Enza village where I live, 1 penny gives or takes 3 seconds off the pendulum. This is great. I was really delighted when I worked it out with the bell ringers. Sort of, okay, so 1 penny equals 3 seconds, and tonight the clocks go forward. But when I first arrived after the first week at Enza, the clocks were going back. And because of my obsession with time and how we experience time and how time is measured, I asked the person in charge of winding the clock each week, could I, this is sheer vanity, could I turn back the hands of time? And so I did at midnight on whatever it was, 28th of October, walked up this bell tower in the dark, up and up and up the bell tower. And then we were there with sort of all the cogs, etc., and absolutely aligned with the centre of the clock. So as the hands were going backwards, this groaning sound, as if the hands are sort of, we should not be going backwards. And just that sense of sort of, you're going back an hour, which takes quite a lot of sort of winding. So that was an absolute highlight, this idea of, yes, I turn back the hands of time, which I'd say it's a vanity, but something that I absolutely enjoyed doing. And again, I think in the conversations with Naima and, by extension with the family from long distance, I've been able to time travel with such amazing detail and accuracy through the correspondence, through conversations, and through also, I think, your diligence, Naima, of going into the archive, typing up faxes which are about to fade, like you're sort of really, really again, just catching these insights of Moki's before literally they fade away.
Like the timeline I gave you, which Moki had typed up, all of the dates of her and Don and her and Don's life. It's amazing, the resources. It just says each year kind of what happened, but it was a fax of the original, and the fax is like you barely see it. And I managed to scan it and then darken it and sent it to Linder. But yeah, it's disappearing.
It's been incredible. I'd wake up and there'd be an email from Naima saying, I've just managed to, I've just typed this, or I've typed this because it's handwritten and maybe you can't understand it. So Naima, I'd just really like to thank you for that. And the whole family, because it could have been so easy for you all to say, now is not the time. But from that first introduction from Judy Blame, you opened the doors to me. And not only that, I could say that just very often very, very intimate correspondence, which I found extremely moving. I mean, I've shed so many tears over a lot of this correspondence, and just that privilege of being party to that, of being sort of, letters and correspondences which are normally kept, like I say, very much within the family realm. So I'd really like to thank all the family, but particularly Naima Karlsson. Thank you.
Thank you.
Is this on? Jim, is this on? Oh, yes. Thank you all for coming, and thank you so much for to all the speakers for this generous, beautiful event. Linder is going to be signing some publications, I believe, and we've got some for sale. So, yeah, great, thank you. And there's some more tea as well. Thank you. I need a scissors.
you.